All right, everything's working. Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome back to the Convo Couch. I am Pasta Jardula. Unfortunately, Fiorella got stuck at the office again today. As you know, she has just returned from the Donbass, doing some great reporting, taking a look and seeing what's going on over there. She wanted to go there since she got on the ground in Moscow, and she was able to get that chance to go do so. Life-changing, she says. She's going to be posting a lot of stuff, talking about a lot of stuff, what she experienced over there. But unfortunately, she couldn't make it today. And I really wanted her to be here, but it's okay. Since this is my idea, I'm going through with this. As you know, I've been talking about the Libertarian Party. I've been talking about possibly what I've been calling the great compromise of sorts, and that's anti-imperialist left who really are down with, not being interventionist, who are for their civil liberties, who are for their freedom of speech, who are big advocates of Julian Assange. Take a look at this Libertarian Party, because we have a lot of same values and we can stand on a lot of common ground. And with that being said, this conversation's been taking place. We've been seeing it on Twitter. I've had one of this guests on before, Dave Smith, who will be here shortly right now. Well, he's in the backstage. Come on with Jimmy Dore and have these conversations. But it seems that we still have to continue these conversations, because if we're going to find a way to come together, like a lot of people are doing on February 19th at the Rage Against the War Machine rally in D.C., building a coalition, that we need to continue to have these conversations to understand each other, to come to common ground, and have grown-up conversations. So let's kick it right off. I'm going to introduce my guests. Starting on first, I'm going to introduce Caleb Maupin, returning to the show. As you know, Caleb Maupin, I would classify you as a modern-day communist. Would you say that, of somewhat of sorts, Caleb?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would accept that description.
Yeah. Once I heard you talk about socialism and communism, you weren't talking about so much the socialism of old. You were talking about what can we come up with today. I always talk about we need some sort of mixed system. And I think that would be good if we were able to sit down and say, this works for us. We like this. We understand that. We understand the labor aspect, and then we can go from there. So thank you so much for joining the show today to have this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here, and I'm hoping to engage with the other two guests. It's going to be interesting.
It's going to be fun. So let's also returning to the show. I talked about Dave Smith. He's come on the show before. We had the famous, I should say, Jimmy Dore, my good friend. We had the Smith Dore 24, kind of just to play a little marketing there, have a little fun. It's a little bit different with Caleb. Caleb, modern day communist. There's not really a powerful communist party in the United States right now. They're not going to get on any ballots or any party line tickets, whatnot. But you are a libertarian of sorts, and your name has been floated maybe for possible office or a position somewhere high or whatnot. The Mises Caucus is now running the show, I should say, new management of sorts in the Libertarian Party, which means nothing to a lot of people because they don't know about the Libertarian Party. And I think a comedian as yourself, a populist person, can really get that message out there, Dave. So thank you so much for joining the show and the conversation today.
Well, thank you. We must both be very modern day communists and libertarians, because Caleb's dressed like a capitalist and I'm dressed like a commie over here. So that's we're really switching things up.
Yes, we are. That's what you're going to get over here at the Convo Couch. Let's bring in our last guest. So true. Look at you. You look like a capitalist, Caleb. Our last guest been on the show before. I've been talking about this guy for quite some time, and it's kind of funny because within the Libertarian Party, people will say Pasta's a spike guy. And that's because after I experienced a lot of time in the Progressive Party, getting in grassroots candidates and whatnot, I didn't see the actual, and forgive me if I'm insulting you here, Spike, the tactician of sorts, the person who can really convey a message to different groups of people. One of the first videos I saw of Spike Cohen, he was out in front of the Capitol speaking to some Black Lives Matter rally people, I think, and you were just breaking it down step by step of what it means to be, I don't think you were really pitching the Libertarian Party, but you were pitching or discussing libertarian ideas, and they were realizing that they had a lot in common with you.
Yeah, I was the one person there that didn't come to demagogue. I came there to, present solutions to what they were upset about. They were upset about police brutality. They were upset about the war on drugs. They were upset about disproportionate enforcement. And so I showed up. It just so happened that I was there at a campaign event in Columbus, found out that the rally was happening there. Me and a bunch of other libertarian candidates for office went over. It wasn't that far away. Listened to what they had to say and said, hey, great news. We're the only ones running to end qualified immunity. We're the only ones running to truly end the war on drugs. And based on that, based on the fact that everyone else that showed up wanted to demagogue about race or demagogue about not really about solutions, but about anger. Let's be angry and let's remain angry because we showed up to actually present solutions. They were very impressed and many of them endorsed us on the spot.
Yeah. And I think that's important because a lot of people in politics right now, they come to demagogue. They wag their finger. They think their way is right. That's the beautiful thing I think about you two in particular, Spike and Dave, is that you guys are listening. You're understanding. You're having conversations. You're just not wagging your finger. At least that's the first impression I got off you guys. I haven't been around in the Libertarian Party long enough to know the true you guys, but I'm finding out more and more information on a daily basis. So thank you for joining us today. Let's start off with Caleb because I want to know what type of communist Caleb is. We called you a modern day communist, Caleb, in the beginning of the show because like I've had many conversations with you. You know about your history. You know about your past, right? And I think there's a lot of differences probably in this panel right now. I don't know up front Dave and Spike's view on history when it comes to a lot of communism. I know I had Scott Horton on the show yesterday, and when he had a chance to go after Mao and Stalin, he did. But sometimes history is not what we know of it. It's what's written, what we're told, what we're programmed. And there's a lot of questions out there. But Caleb, why don't you give us a little opening about what type of communist you are and how that relates to what you're trying to achieve today?
Well, the first thing I want to make clear is that if I thought that the woke left were a representative of communism, if I thought that these people running around, burning buildings and advocating censorship on the internet, who want to allow Silicon Valley to silence free speech, who support the lockdowns, who are cheering for World War III against Russia, if I thought those people were communists, I'd hate communism too. I absolutely would. And, what I call the synthetic left, these entities that are a result of CIA programs like MK Ultra and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, these folks that are funded by the wealthiest capitalists, George Soros and the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks, those folks are not representative of anything that I stand for. I'll tell you that much. The life-changing experiences that I've had is when I've gone to global communist gatherings. I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador in 2013. I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Sochi, Russia in 2017. I've been to Venezuela. I've been to Nicaragua. I've been to countries where there are big communist parties that are leading millions of people. And what's interesting is, Dave, when he was starting out, he said, I look like a capitalist and he looks like a communist. When I go to actual countries where there are big, major communist parties, they wear suits and ties. They look like serious worker politicians and they represent millions of people. And their focus is on economic development. It's about raising people up out of poverty. 21st century socialism in the Bolivarian countries, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which has raised more people out of poverty than any other system in history. It's about using state power and controlling the market to raise people up. It's about promoting technology and innovation. And the ultimate goal, if you read what Karl Marx wrote in his critique of the Goethe program, is for a society with so much wealth and abundance that the state can fade away, that there can be total equality, social hierarchies can fade away, labor becomes life's prime want, meaning people only work because they feel like it, to not be bored. It's not a necessity. Labor is no longer a necessity because technology has advanced so much. 21st century socialism, the movement that has raised millions of people out of poverty, that has turned Russia and China into superpowers, that has built some of the biggest telecommunications manufacturing corporations in the world, has has the fastest trains in the world in China these days. This system of having an economy that is organized to serve public good and having a government of action that fights for working families and utilizes the market to strengthen an overall state-run economy. That's the vision that has been very successful in both the 20th century and the 21st century. Obviously, the Soviet Union had problems, and we've modernized, and things have changed. But around the world, if you get past the woke left and all these, hipster kids that think they're Marxists, there is a global communist movement that runs many countries: Vietnam, China, Angola, many countries around the world, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and they have had very positive results by utilizing a market sector to fit in with an overall state central vision for leading toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world, building up and advancing technology. And I think a lot of libertarians, if they saw it this way, if they saw that we believe in technology, we believe in growth, and we believe in innovation, and we see capitalism and the rule of the world by big banks and big corporations, what Lenin called imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage, the highest stage of capitalism. I think if a lot of libertarians saw that we believe in growth, and we are opposed to these global big corporations and the governments that enforce their will with war, I think they might have a different perspective.
Well, I'm going to just let one of the guys, Dave or Spike, jump in. I'm assuming when they heard the word state power or state control, that's when they got a little bit of, because, we know how they hate government. I think that, libertarianism obviously has a lot of tendencies of anarchism, where we want no state, we want no overreaching power. Dave, why don't you jump in and give us your take on what type of libertarian you are and what you're all about, and why it might not be so great to go the communist route over here.
Yeah, well, I suppose then after listening to, I'm not very familiar with Caleb, but after listening to his open remarks, I suppose you could say all three of us are anarchists. Me and Spike are both anarcho-capitalists, basically. Yep. Believe in the non-aggression principle, self-ownership, private property rights. And Caleb is also a communist anarchist in the sense that the ultimate end goal would be the withering away of the state for a stateless, classless society. I would certainly be skeptical that the path toward abolishing the state would be to grow the state to be tremendously powerful. That seems counterproductive to me, and I don't think you're ever going to end up getting to that point. I think I can speak for Spike as well, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not, because I know Spike very well, that both me and Spike have really no issue with socialism so long as it's voluntary. I mean, we have no issue with worker co-ops or people buying up plots of land and sharing them around. No issue with, all pitching in for mutual aid or something like this to take care of healthcare or something like this. Private sector unions, collective bargaining in that sense, I have no problem with. I do have quite an issue when it's being forced on people. I don't agree with your assessment of history. I think that both it's not as if there were like some problems with the Soviet Unions or some problem with Mao Zedong's China, but overall it helped the country and turned them into superpowers. I think these were two of the most horrific regimes that have ever existed. And I would say that China has, while they're still, of course, the in name Communist Party, that's the one party dictatorship over there, they certainly have moved far away from the communism of Mao Zedong, announcing that wealth is now good, making it much easier for people to start businesses and make money. I think that is much more accurately what is their kind of what's helped improve the situation for millions of people over there in China, although it's obviously still a lot of problems. I do agree with the criticisms of the imperialist West. I think that, if you want to describe that as capitalism, because semantic debates are the most boring and least productive debates, I would just say that what me and Spike are advocating for is laissez-faire, non-interventionist free markets, and that certainly the most powerful government in the history of the world, the United States of America, going all around the world, starting wars for profit, is certainly not anything that we would be advocating for. So I'll say this, that in the spirit of what we've talked about the last few times on the show, we are all opposed to the American warfare machine. That is, despite what any other economic differences we may have, that's a pretty damn important agreement. I think about those missiles that those Ukrainian missiles that hit Poland a few months back, but when Zelensky came out and blamed it on Russia, we had politicians here in America advocating, invoking Article 5. Just the other day, there was some in the German parliament, one of their politicians announced that Germany was at war with Russia, which, always works out really well when Germany and Russia go to war.
Yeah.
This is, it's kind of, the stakes are very high. And I do look at this kind of like, if you were like an abolitionist during slavery and you were like, but we disagree on tax policy or something like that, it'd still be a pretty important issue that you were both on the same side of. So I do kind of feel that, but I don't know. I guess I could stop there. Let Spike go.
Well, let Spike jump in, because this question I have for Spike is what Dave just said. The one thing talking about, like, he disagrees with the assessment of Mao and Stalin. You know what I'm saying? But this is something that I often, when I have discussions with libertarians about too, as well, is that they'll agree that the interventionism, causes a reaction from these countries to, act a certain way or go to certain, methods. And I'm not saying that they were the Boy Scouts by any means, but I've been down to Nicaragua and I've seen collectivism, and I've seen the number one issue be national sovereignty and the way a country has to bond together. I mean, we talked about this briefly, Dave, before the live show. It's about Cuba, like, Castro, like, he didn't come out there and like, communism, it's what's for dinner. He didn't sell communism. He was forced to eventually go along with the Soviet Union. And Caleb, we've talked about this too as well.
Yes.
So when you talk about Mao, when you talk about Stalin, the thing that kind of gets me, and Spike, please jump in, because, I want to also know what your biggest beef with socialism is, but a lot of these collective countries or countries who've gone through this collective government, it's just simply a reaction from the empire with their boot on their neck. So how can we really be criticized? How can we criticize all these other countries and all these other governments, especially the systems, when we have to clean our own house first? Go ahead, Spike.
Well, there's certainly a point to be made there. I mean, one could argue that in the same way that what we call the woke left is really just fascist imperialism wrapped in a rainbow flag, what we are now calling Chinese communism is really an increasingly authoritarian but almost Western style corporatism wrapped in a Chinese communist flag. But I would say it's correct that is a kind of reaction to Western forces or Western elements of Western policy, where the corporatists who run things in the Western world, in order to basically destroy their smaller competition, so poison the well with regulatory burdens and tax burdens in their home countries that they destroyed their competition, with the idea that they would go over to countries like China and like Vietnam and so forth and set up shop there. And then use the U.S. military to guard, protect their products as they're shipped back into this country, thereby, basically closing off entire markets to themselves. The exchange there, the trade-off, was that China would adopt an increasingly a less communist or less socialist push for how their government is run, and more of a corporatist one, which is why we see a lot of the elements in China that we see in the West, but just even more so. Yes, we see this broadly or seemingly fastly growing economy, but we also seeing an increasingly authoritarian structure, more and more censorship. We were talking about censorship earlier. We see more and more censorship. We see more and more of an aggressive stance in the region, although nothing.
You're talking about China now, right? You're talking.
Yeah, we're talking specifically about China.
This is the thing. I don't want to interrupt you, but see, as you're saying that, Spike, and I got to stop you and stuff like that. We're talking about there being more authoritarian, they're being more this. They're lifting way more people out of poverty, and our streets are getting filled with more and more homeless people. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
so I don't mean to stop you, but this is the part
until the debt bubble bursts. So China, we talk about the debt bubble and inflation that's happening here, and the looming threat of that. If you compare that to China's, it's barely even comparable. And the point of that is, yes, in part, that was a reaction to things that were happening in the West, to basically create monopolies in those Western regimes. What I would say is that our criticism, if you wanted to say a criticism of communism writ large, is that, like Dave said, this is the idea that you can have a large and growing state that is somehow going to eventually fade away. That's not what governments do. Governments get bigger and get bigger and get bigger until they're checked, not because people go, okay, thanks, we don't need you anymore, but because people say, no, we don't, we refuse this. And I mean, just looking at China's zero COVID policy, I don't think that a country whose government has done this and continues in some cases to do this to people is going to anytime soon turn into anything resembling statelessness.
I'm going to let Caleb respond to that. And I don't want to lose my chain of thought here. You know what? I'll let you jump right in, Caleb, and I'll circle the wagon, because the solution, Spike, is the thing that it just drives me crazy sometimes when I'm speaking to libertarians about economics, right? Like, it's always like, well, we have to eliminate the state because the state's the problem. It's not just going to go away. I don't think that government is just necessarily the problem. I believe that people are the problem. It's not that government is corrupt. It's that people are corrupt. So how just by removing the entity of government is just this going to straighten itself out? And let Spike respond to that.
Yeah, I'd like, I'll answer that specific thing, and I won't go into a whole diatribe so that Caleb can talk about this. Government is simply people with centralized power and presumption of authority. That's what government is. So yes, we understand that there is no what we call a Rothbard button where you can press it and government goes away. But we believe that the answer is scaling back government. And yes, it's going to be incremental, but scaling back government, and in doing so, scaling back the power that the corporate entities are able to exercise through government, and decentralizing that power back to the people, as opposed to having it centralized into a relative handful of people. And that any push to further centralize and consolidate that power is going to have the opposite of any potentially intended effect of helping the people as a whole. So that's what I would say about that. Yes, people can be corrupted. They're corrupted through power. And so when you centralize power, they're even more corrupted.
That makes sense. Go ahead, Caleb, respond.
Okay, well, I got a couple things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is we got to be clear about what terms mean. You know, when you all say capitalism, you probably just mean freedom, starting your own business, etc. And we have different definitions of these terms. When I say capitalism, I mean a system where production is organized for profit, where the primary motive force behind economic activity is private entities looking to enrich themselves. Socialism is when the means of production, the banks and the factories and the major industries and the centers of economic power are forced to operate according to a central plan, so that growth is no longer restrained and they can continue to operate without the boom-bust cycle and without the problems intrinsic in capitalism. I always use the example of self-driving cars. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a great thing. All the labor that goes into driving and traffic courts and Uber drivers would be gotten rid of. People could focus their labor elsewhere. We'd have a much more productive society. But Andrew Yang pointed out that under our system, self-driving cars would lead to riots in the streets. There would be mass unemployment and hunger. And this is the problem of capitalism. The capitalist is always looking to produce as many goods as possible. But in the process of doing so, he wants to eliminate the jobs. The worker cannot buy back what he produces. You have a frequent problem of gluts and overproduction, the tendency of the rate of profits to fall. This is the Marxist understanding. And I also want to talk about, you know, when you talk about freedom, and this is a very important point. And I guess freedom in any society is always proportional to the amount of economic development that there is. Nobody anywhere in the world was talking about freedom of speech or freedom of religion or freedom of assembly until like the 1400s in Europe. And were people just evil until John Locke was born? Of course not. There was just not a level of economic development that could necessitate and allow that kind of freedom. That the dawn of capitalism emerging from feudalism gave birth to a new level of abundance and productivity in society, which led to a new level of freedom. And the understanding that Marxists have is that with a rationally planned economy, the level of abundance and prosperity in society can grow up to the point that eventually we can have a world in which a state and a government is not necessary. But the road to doing so is getting past the artificial restraints on human productivity that come from the irrationality of the market. We need a government that will control the means of production. And, you know, when you said that China has this debt bubble that's hanging over their heads, I've heard that my whole life. China's always about to fall. Capitalist economists, they look at China and they say, oh, that they can't have this much growth. This isn't possible. According to the laws of capitalism, yes, they should have a big correction. Their economy should have crashed about 10 times by now. But it hasn't, because profits are not in command. In 2015, when their stock market went down and dropped dramatically, within a week, it was right back up, because the Communist Party made some phone calls and they banned short selling, and they threatened people on the threat of arrest if they moved in certain ways. And the state-run industries were told what to do. And the stock market bounced right back up because profits are not in command. And I will say, you know, with all due respect to our friends here, one of the frustrations I have with libertarians is the selective interpretation of what's capitalist and what's socialist. You know, libertarians told us Obamacare was communism. You know, that because the government's getting more involved in healthcare, we're going to have full communism and gulags and death camps. Obamacare is communism. But China, where the government owns the banks, where the government owns the major industries, where they have 5-year economic plans to plan out their economy, where there's a Marxist-Leninist party that's in charge, where even private corporations can't do what is profitable and are basically told what to do in line with the central plan. Somehow that's capitalism. Why? Well, everyone knows communism doesn't work and China's successful, so it must be capitalist. Whereas Obamacare, you know, which is just an adjustment of our for-profit healthcare system, which is a disaster. Oh, well, it must be communism because it's bad. And this is this selective interpretation. Anything bad in the United States is communist. Anything good China does is capitalist.
Well,
you know,
hold on. Can I
That's not what
respond?
we said.
Yeah, can we respond to some of this?
Yeah, let's let Dave get in there, because I think in all fairness, I don't think it was a lot of the libertarians that was saying that Obamacare was communist. I think it was more of the Alex Jones type and neoconservatives and populist right. But go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think you tore that straw man to shreds, but that's not what any libertarian who said Obamacare is communism is probably just goofy and stupid. I don't know. What I said, and what I'd imagine Spike said at the time too, was that it was a completely crony scam that was going to lead to premiums increasing and crappy health care, and that the profits of the health insurance companies would go up. And we were completely right about that. What I actually said just a few minutes ago here was that China moved away from communism, comparing their current regime to Mao Zedong, and I think that's objectively
is that a
true.
Fair statement?
That it is.
Statement, Caleb?
They now praise wealth. They now allow people to own businesses. I mean, like, yes, it's less communist than it once was.
Can we just
I don't agree with that. I think communism always praised wealth. If you look at Karl Marx, he was saying that, you know, the ultimate goal is a society with so much abundance. The goal of the Communist Party is to increase wealth in society. The problem with capitalism is that it holds back productive forces. In China, during the 1950s and 60s, they had a heavily state-run economy. In the 1970s and 80s, they adjusted to have more of a state sector. But the Soviet Union did the same thing. In the 1920s, they had the new economic policy in the Soviet Union. Then you had Stalin and the 5-year economic plans. And that socialism is always adjusting. Venezuela has a much smaller state sector than China does at this point. You know, Venezuela, the oil is in the hands of the state, and the oil is used to subsidize, but it's largely a private economy. Nicaragua, their big success has been their micro entrepreneurship program, where the state loans money to Nicaraguans to start their own businesses. And socialism is constantly adjusting. You know, there's a big private sector in many socialist countries. There's worker cooperatives. There's state-run industry.
All right, well, let's let.
Okay, fine. I mean, fine. You can say
is planning.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Listen. Let me. You can say it's always adjusting. Okay. My point is that in this case, it adjusted to allowing more business and profits. But okay, whatever. It's very easy to start a business in China. In many cases, much easier than it is in the United States of America. Regardless of any of that, when you define. Look, again, I don't want to get just trapped into this semantic debate, but when you just define capitalism as seeking profits, that's just not anyone's accurate definition of what capitalism is, even not the capitalism that I would defend. Capitalism is about private ownership of the means of production, private ownership of property. Now, there's obviously lots of different schemes within there, but for example, the vast majority of businesses either don't make a profit or make very, very little profit. It's that there's lots of millions of nonprofit businesses and millions of businesses where basically the owners squeak out a living. They might draw a salary out of that business, but there's really no profits to speak of. This is most people who own a business. They're probably in that situation. There are a few big businesses that make tons of profits and a few mid-sized businesses that make nice profits. The worst of the big ones are always in bed with governments. But I just think that regardless, I think it's probably more productive for us to just talk about what the system that we are advocating for and the system that you're advocating for,
right,
rather than kind of say we're defining capitalism as everything bad in the West, or communism as communism, anything where there's central planning. The issue, I would say, you made a lot of assertions about how we're for communism or we're for socialism because this is the system that leads to economic productivity. This is what raises up the standard of living. I think that's blatantly false. And it's just not true that the average, if you look at through the reign of Lenin or Stalin, if you look at through the reign of Mao Zedong, the idea that the average person was doing better than the average person in the United States of America, I think is just not true.
Well, first of all, right, to say that it's better than the United States, that's not the comparison. Is it better than what was there before? And there is no question that under the leadership of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Russia went from being an agrarian, impoverished country without electrification, with mass illiteracy, to being a superpower that had the biggest power plants in the world,
and
steel mills in the world.
Slaves
they defeated the Nazis.
Yes.
They invented space travel. And
but
this is the lie. I was told this in school. Communism failed everywhere.
This is no type of
had huge astronomical successes.
Right, but this is
the life expectancy went up, living conditions went up.
Okay,
let's let Dave. Yeah, let's let
who
Dave
patented
respond.
the first mobile phone? It was Kaprianovich in the Soviet Union. But communism never invents anything, right?
But no one said that, dude. Just stop.
Hold on, guys.
Who built
Listen,
the world's largest hydroelectric power plant?
Caleb, one second.
Let's let Dave respond. Come on, now.
Like listing off inventions and stuff. Also, listen, just let's cut with the straw man. You don't have to answer. You don't have to argue against things I never said. I never said communism didn't invent anything. I also think that this idea that say things were better than they were before under these systems. I mean, sure, not for the millions of people who starved to death, they weren't, but for some people, actually, I'm sure it was.
Starvation was much larger before the
let me just get a sentence.
All the time.
All right. Let me just get a sentence out, dude.
The communists cured the famine. They're the ones that eliminated.
Caleb, this isn't going to be worth it if you just talk over me every couple words.
Let him respond
here. As Noam Chomsky pointed out once before, slaves in the year 1850 were wealthier than slaves were in the year 1750. Things had improved. The conditions were better for them. Their life expectancy was higher. None of that in any way is an argument for slavery being a just system or the system that you want. So what I was just saying is that if you're saying that communism is a system that lifts people out of wealth, well, then why can't I compare capitalist countries where people were lifted out of wealth or lifted out of poverty, rather, that, if you look at the Industrial Revolution in England and in the United States of America, by the end of it, people were living at a standard that was unfathomable. I mean, with the standard of living that we all enjoy right now is something that would have sounded like magic to people who were here a couple hundred years ago. So if you're using this standard to praise communism, then that same argument is going to work for capitalism. I mean, look at can I list off all of the inventions that have come out of Western society?
This is not where I wanted the conversation to go about us arguing about the history of capitalism and communism, because I knew we would get to this point. Because I'm sorry, Dave, and once again, it's not that I'm advocating for communists. I look at myself as a leftist libertarian who wants a mixed system of sorts. But at the end of the day, I see a lot of Americans in all different types of ideology, especially on the conservative right side, whether it be libertarian, populist right, that want to wag the finger at all these other countries and their systems when they have a lot of these systems because of our actions. It's just
I don't disagree with that. Listen, I don't disagree with that. And
if we have this argument about why communism is so bad, I want to know why Austrian economics and that's capitalism in your mind, Spike and Dave, how it's going to work today. And same thing for you, Caleb. How is it going to work today? instead of
Yeah,
arguing the past.
Fair.
So
Fair.
I don't think that anyone could argue that authoritarianism doesn't beget authoritarianism, and so I would agree to that extent. Even though I will say I think that this, if anything, this discussion hasn't been contentious enough, I'm going to try to maybe extend an olive branch in the form of saying that we've been doing a lot of capitalism versus communism, often using different terms for both, sometimes flex using terms, going back and forth on them. I think what libertarians as a whole believe is that in any given system, in any given situation, the more authoritarian that becomes, the more authoritarian that those in charge become, the more authoritarian the so-called solutions become, the worse the outcomes are, and the more that centralization of power also leads to the centralization of wealth. It turns out that the most powerful people also become the most wealthy people. So if you look at any attempt to try to use the state and thereby grow the state to try to achieve an outcome, however noble that outcome may be, it's going to end up being bad. And here's an example that went across all different definitions, which was the COVID regime. The COVID regime was alive and well in the United States, in China, in Australia, in North Korea, in Russia, in all of the European countries, all through most of Latin America and much of Africa and much of Asia. And what we saw, whatever flavor of the COVID regime or whatever they were called, whatever kind of system they were calling themselves, a admittedly noble desire to try to save lives, almost immediately, if not from its very beginning, turned into incredibly powerful, wealthy people and corporations and powerful politicians using this thing as a fear-mongering tactic to get people to go along with what they would have never agreed to under any situation since. And China, in that case, was one of the most egregious examples, but the U.S. was as well. And so a perfect example of how we can sit here and argue about communism versus capitalism versus socialism versus libertarianism versus whatever. The reality is, the more power is centralized into a small handful of people, the more they're going to abuse it because they can.
Okay.
And so the whole idea is to try to decentralize that power as much as possible. And like Dave said at the beginning of this, that the idea that if we snapped our fingers and either government went away or was greatly reduced and there was more individual power, that we'd all voluntarily organize the exact same way is the height of fantasy. Of course, there are going to be voluntary collectives. Of course, there's going to be voluntary, more what we'd call capitalist type systems. Of course, there are going to be all sorts of different ways that this manifests, mixed systems and everything else, things we haven't even thought of yet. And why not, instead of trying to define or fight behind definitions and fight over which failed examples of authoritarianism worked best or worse, just acknowledge that we do best when we're most free, and we do worse when we are less free and there's more power in the hands of a small handful of people.
Okay,
Yeah.
so really quick question, and Dave, you can follow up. You're right. So how in your system moving forward, let's say the Libertarian Party got some power, took over. How in your system do we make sure that the most vulnerable don't fall through the cracks, Spike? And I want to, Dave, I want you to follow up on this, and then we'll let you roll right into it, Caleb.
So a presidential candidate we had in 1996 and 2000, arguably one of the best we've ever had, Harry Brown. He liked to say that, what government's main function is to walk up to you, break your legs, steal your wallet, use some of the money to buy you some crutches, and then say, hey, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have any crutches. And so I would say that first and foremost, absent government, or again, because Dave and I are both anarcho-capitalists, the Libertarian Party has minarchists, constitutionalists, so we don't want to speak on behalf of all libertarians. We are both from a specific subset of libertarianism, but absent authoritarianism, to whatever degree that there is, there would be a direct correlation with there being fewer people in poverty, because you wouldn't have intentionally implemented regulatory burdens, things like telling someone that they have to have a multi-$1,000 business license to be able to braid hair for a living, or have to spend tens of thousands of dollars in compliance costs to DJ at someone's party or something like that. Removing the barriers and burdens that force people to remain in poverty, removing things like our version of the welfare state, which actually incentivizes people not to thrive and punishes them for thriving, removing taxation systems that are disproportionately rob those with the least to then hand that money and future debt to the wealthiest among us, and hand the debt for that to the least wealthy among us, you'd have less poverty to begin with. So right off the bat, before you even removed the safety net, so to speak, by simply adding some of the rungs back to the bottom of the ladder, many of the people would be able to climb out of the net and then use the wealth that they would have to help pull others out of the net. And then whoever is left that for whatever reason simply cannot help themselves, and there's always going to be that, the poor is always going to be among us, there would be things like voluntary mutual aid, voluntary charity, things that actually come from the anti-authoritarian or partially from the anti-authoritarian left that could help fill that gap. And I ranted for quite a bit there, so I want to make sure Dave and Caleb get
Dave, jump on in, because
weigh
then
in on this too.
All right, Dave, jump on in, because then me and I'm sure, because I have a lot of questions. I have a hard time with this part of the libertarian mindset. I really do. Like, I get the fact, and don't get me wrong, I have some beautiful anarchist friends. Keith McHenry, who started Food Not Bombs, is one of the greatest anarchists. Beautiful man. And the way he describes anarchism is, I love it. I really do. Rules, no rulers, a free society. Nobody has a monopoly on violence. I love that stuff. But I still have a hard time thinking that if we just sweat government, that all our problems will go away. That instead of rules being made in a city hall or a courtroom, they won't be made any better. Not to say that they're not. They're made in a corporate boardroom right now, right? So, I mean, we already have that, but please go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah, they already are. So.
But I think you almost answered your question at the end.
You almost did, yeah.
It's like, right. So basically, that's the system that you end up living under, and it doesn't even really matter if it's a corporation or just some very powerful person connected to the government.
Right.
That look, I mean, it's like I'll just kind of second what Spike said, and then maybe add a couple other things there. But like, it's kind of like you're asking, it's like if you're I don't know. I'm trying to think of like an analogy. It's like if you're just like beating the crap out of your dog and you're like, what can we do to help this dog? It's like, well, step one might be stop beating the crap out of him. Like, that'd be pretty. And there's so much that we would do. The idea of getting this government to help poor people. I mean, it's like, okay, step one would probably be stop screwing them over at every single turn. Just like Spike was saying, and it's true for so many jobs. You have any idea how hard it is to become like a plumber? It's insane, the hurdles and the barriers that government sets up. And they're screwed over by the government education system that completely betrays the most vulnerable people. I mean, it's an absolute outrage. You look at these schools, they spend, the national average is over $10,000 per student per year. And in the poorest areas, these kids come out illiterate. They've collected, $200,000 per classroom per year and done nothing for these kids. Of course, obviously, the criminal justice system is just horrific and crushes people who don't deserve it. Nonviolent, victimless crimes and stuff like this. But the idea of like, how would we help these people is kind of, as you guys were touching on before, you're saying this is a question of the nature of people. People have to be willing to do this. And if they're not, then I don't see why we should expect that they'll be like, people aren't good enough to help other people, but they will be good enough to vote in politicians who promise to help us. Like, that's really the pathway to help the most marginalized amongst us. And you just see over and over again why trying this never yields the results that you want. What people need is their liberty. What people need is to be able to pursue their life and not have unreasonable obstacles in their way. And if there are people who fall through the cracks, we need to have organizations that can help them. There's no reason, I think, why that can't be done voluntarily and why that can't be done at the most local level. The problem when you have like a big national government forcefully, coercively taking people's money and saying that they're gonna, create these programs to help poor people. The problem is that it's completely indiscriminate, and you end up incentivizing or disincentivizing people to work and create wealth or pull themselves out. You end up incentivizing the very thing that you're trying to, eliminate. And of course, it's not just like that drips of the bucket leak out. It's like by the time it gets back to the people, it's a drip of what was put in the bucket to begin with. Think about, like the COVID stimulus checks where they, handed out a crummy $600 to regular people and gave trillions away to giant corporations. It's just, if you're hoping to get this help through a centralized national government, good luck.
There's a lot of logic there.
I
know you want to jump in here, and I'm sure we're going to hear about the history of how socialism worked in this particular situation. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Go right ahead, buddy.
Well, we want to get away from the history, like you said. So let's talk about, you talk about now how the government is just working for these big ultra monopolies, Amazon, Walmart, the big banks, the big oil companies. That's who the government works for. Meanwhile, it's small business owners who are getting crushed. I want you to imagine that instead of a government that worked for Jeff Bezos and worked for the Rockefellers and worked for the DuPonts and the Carnegies and was crushing your local small business, that we had a very strong government based in communities with organizations in every neighborhood that was getting together, and that government, instead of working for Jeff Bezos, was kicking Jeff Bezos' ass and was kicking the ass of the Rockefellers and was nationalizing the big oil companies and using the wealth to build new highways and new high-speed railway and new universities and giving stimulus and economic money and stimulus and loans to private small businesses so they can flourish. That's the kind of government that they have in Venezuela. That's the kind of government they have in Nicaragua. That's the kind of government they have in China. A government that represents the people and supports the small businesses as well as the industrial working class against the big monopolies and corporations. That's the kind of government that has been very successful around the world. It's a government based in communities that has the ability to mobilize millions of people to beat back the power of big banks and big oil companies and control the economy on behalf of the population at large. I also want to point this out, which is you guys are against wars, and that is awesome. And that is why I will march with you 100 times more than I'll ever march with the woke left, because you guys are against these wars. You're speaking up about the threat of a new war against China, the escalation in Ukraine. But I do want to point out, what is it that the United States war machine goes around the world doing? It goes around the world overthrowing socialist governments and bringing in capitalism. Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi, had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. It built the world's largest irrigation system. It had wiped out illiteracy. And it was with NATO bombs that Libya was brought into the free market. Iraq was once an independent country selling oil on the international markets, and it's now been brought into the free market with bombs and destruction. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was toppled and the West came in there. And what did they impose? Under the Yeltsin administration, the Clinton administration, they brought in Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, and they imposed radical free market policies. And this war machine is what you guys call crony capitalism. That's what you guys call it. That's a great example of what it is. But my understanding is that all capitalism is crony capitalism. Whenever a small group of people own the banks and the factories and the means of production, they are going to rig things on their behalf. And they're going to try to get rid of their competitors, both around the world and at home. And they're going to try to centralize power in their hands. And what we need is a mass democratic awakening of the people, involvement of the population, to mobilize, to give strength to strong leaders that are strong enough to stand up to the rich and powerful and organize and force the economy to work in public interest, build infrastructure, fund technological research and invention, stimulate economic growth. And really the scariest thing, and this is why I think libertarians are very popular these days, is we can all see that what the ultra rich want, what the World Economic Forum wants, what Jeff Bezos wants, what Bill Gates wants, is they want degrowth. They want to drive down living standards, and this is to save their system. It's the only way they can save their system, because the capitalist system cannot handle the computer revolution. The problem of abundance creating poverty, people being homeless because there are too many houses, people being hungry because there's too much food, the irrationality of the capitalist system cannot handle human innovation. Human creativity and innovation has gone beyond the narrow constraints of the irrational profit organized economy. And so at this point, they're trying to save their system with kind of a global fascism, degrowth. And people around the world are resisting it. The Belt and Road Initiative from China is resisting it. The Eurasian Economic Union of Russia is resisting it. The Bolivarian Alternative of Latin America is resisting it. Humanity is saying we will grow. We will advance. We will raise people out of poverty. We will have electricity. We will have running water. And that is the global thrust. And I think a lot of small business owners, when it really gets down to it, would prefer we had a government that fought for them against the big monopolies.
Well, I mean, yeah, look, it's just a lot to respond to, and it's hard. We're not going to have time here because we got to go soon to get into all of the like historical arguments. I disagree with your interpretation of a lot of these events. Certainly, it is true that that the war in Iraq and the war in Libya, also the war in Somalia, which really doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but has been every war in American history, the longest running war now in American history since we got out of Afghanistan. Which was, by the way, an anarchist society that had a lot of business and trading going on there, and they were doing much better than they had ever historically done too, until George W. Bush destroyed the whole country. So all those wars were terrible, awful. Now that doesn't mean you don't have to be a binary thinker and then say that therefore means that Saddam Hussein was really great. He was actually a pretty brutal dictator. We just made things much, much worse and killed a whole lot of innocent people for no reason other than to enrich a lot of weapons companies and some other, neoconservative goals that they were trying to achieve there. None of these countries were brought into the free market. And it's interesting that you call this, that like, if you want to call it global capitalism, maybe you can get away with pulling that off. But the idea that this is a free market, this is Pax Americana, this is the control of all the markets top down in a top down dictatorial way. And in fact, if you really want to look at what the military does when they occupied Iraq, they run it like a socialist country. It is completely top down, run by the United States government. They essentially become a socialist satellite of the United States of America. Even when the sham democracy, even when they voted for us to leave, we didn't leave. So I don't think any of that's right. Now, it might be true that small businesses might like a government that was giving them special privilege. But I got to tell you, everything that you said there, and what if imagine a government doing this, which again, you can always say, imagine a dictator who's really great, or imagine an anarcho-capitalist society where all the poor people are fed. I don't know how compelling of an argument that is, but even as you said that, sounded awful to me. I don't want a government that's crushing Jeff Bezos. I just want a government that's not in bed with him. And if he can succeed because he provides value to a whole bunch of people and makes life easier for them, and hey, look at this, my wife doesn't have to get in the car and drive in the snow to go buy diapers. She could just order them on Amazon. I got no problem with that. I certainly don't want the government to be heavily investing in small businesses. My God, the vast majority of small businesses fail. So they're going to be taking other people's money by force and then throwing it away on small businesses. The whole point of letting someone start a small business is like, hey, you think you have an idea that other people will benefit from. A lot of times people are wrong about that, but hey, you take the risk. And if it turns out bad, you lose money and you got to start back over. If it turns out good, you get to reap the benefits of it. That's the type of society I want, is where people are free. That's what I'm looking for.
And it also wouldn't disallow for what you're talking about, or at least the collective ownership. It would have to be with people who wanted that. And the idea that anyone should be forced into anything is what all of us, I believe, should be against here, including the people that have tried to force the world into a US-led so-called rules-based order, which is basically just, as Caleb said, global fascism. You're 100% correct on that. They're trying to force people in a system that they may or may not even want. And like Dave said, there is no free market behind live under the US petrodollar system, or we'll murder as many of you as we have to until you do. That's not a thing. That's not anyone calling that free market. That's not a free market.
I'm so sorry. I don't want to interrupt you. We could because I know Dave's got to get out of here, and I want to get this last question into you guys. I'm sorry, Spike, to cut you off.
Sure. No, go ahead. Please do.
The reason why I accelerated this conversation right now today is because as I'm dipping my toe into the Libertarian Party, trying to see how you guys can come together with a centralized message in a decentralized party, right? It's going to be tough, especially since you have to run as a party working together. And you have, I see right off the bat, they got a lot of individuals who want to express their feelings, not thinking of it as a whole and how it's going to affect them. And that's what happened when I saw the Twitter, and it was pretty much bashing on socialism while giving capitalism a tongue bath or something. What's a good comedic term when you're really blowing smoke up Sunshine's ass, Dave? Really lifting up capitalism and stuff. Now, here's the thing that really bothered me. I don't think you have to come out there and go rah, rah, rah for socialism, right? I don't think you have to come out there and go rah, rah, rah for capitalism. But as a party, when you are bashing socialism and we're trying to bring people into this tent, people like myself who have a lot of socialist friends, Marxist friends, that are Americans that are just anti-imperialist first, and they can come together you on that issue. To me, that says you're not bashing socialism. You're bashing their needs, their wants, what they want. As we heard Caleb talk today, a lot of the things he presented come from labor. And what a lot of socialists, whether they be right or wrong, what they want is not corporations coming in, taking over their resources, taking away their national sovereignty. And the same token, Caleb, I've heard from people on the left all the time talk about socialism being the greatest thing on the earth, but not talking about too much centralized power and how that could be a very big problem in our society and not taking accountability for that. So I want to just use this closeout right now while you guys close out and get off here on addressing that and understanding, hey, man, Spike, Dave, I get it. You're not going to be socialist. You're not going to advocate for socialism. But could we at least as Americans right now advocate and understand for their needs and vice versa, Caleb, when it comes to their needs? Dave, go ahead and start off. And
okay, yeah, let me just go because I'm pressed for time. I got to get out of here. But I think that's a legitimate criticism, and I think probably look. I mean, online you always see no one can ever control their online audience and stuff like that, and there's always some people who are presenting ideas in a bad way. I think absolutely that we should be trying to sell a message, because this is what we believe in caring about people. I mean, this is why the reason why I'm a libertarian is because governments destroy innocent people's lives, and I hate that. That's basically what it all comes down to. And that I believe that given more liberty, people will be more prosperous and there'll be more peace in the world. And I think those are peace and prosperity and civilization is basically what we should all be in this for. I'd also say that there was an old like Noam Chomsky had something he said years ago that always really stuck with me, where he was basically talking about how, like, if you were like in the Soviet Union or something like this, if you were like one of Stalin's men, and they used to love doing this all the time, they'd constantly be bashing America for like racism or segregation or different things that America had done wrong. And then in America, they'd constantly be bashing the commies for all of their human rights abuses and all this stuff. And there's something where it's like, yeah, that's a little convenient. Like it's very convenient if you live in a society where your government's committing a lot of human rights abuses, that your number one concern is all the human rights abuses going on in other governments. If you look at what the Libertarian Party is tweeting, what its most prominent members like Spike Cohen, Justin Amash, like guys like this, what they're always talking about, it is always, I mean, with very rare exception, it is blasting the corrupt system of the United States of America's federal government. I mean, sometimes local issues and stuff like that, but like high 90% of the time, that's what we're railing against, is this most corrupt system, this fascistic corporatist system that just rapes the American people, all for the benefit of big pharma, big weapons companies, and the big banking complex industry that has absolutely just destroyed this economy. It's destroyed the dollar, and it's destroyed the potential of where we could be. When you asked earlier about how we could be helping poor and marginalized people, I mean, look, it's $1 trillion a year that we extract from this economy to maintain our empire around the world. It's trillions of dollars, trillions and trillions of dollars that create this whole artificial Wall Street economy. And this all has to do with us being on fiat currency, artificially low interest rates, creating a market for speculators, this artificial market. And then if you go look at just where the wealthiest, if you go look at the wealthiest districts in America, like I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but like the top 20 wealthiest districts, it's like the majority of them are like the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Yep. It's all the politically connected people. They're stealing, extracting the wealth from the American people. It's hard to even fathom how good those people would be doing if we just hadn't done that. we just hadn't been robbing them for all of these years. But I would also point out that that's what centralized power does for you. This government right now, the United States of America's federal government, spends over $6 trillion a year. It is the most powerful organization in human history. They can kill anyone on the planet by pressing a button and having a drone strike hit them. I mean, it's like an ungodly amount of power. And what Spike was getting at before is that the only way forward to solve this is to have a decentralization of this power, to try to return the power more to, if we can't get all the way to anarchism, at least make governments more local, smaller, and more responsive to their citizenry. So I'd end on that.
The show we do,
and I got to run. Pleasure talking with both of you. Very nice to meet you, Caleb.
We got to do it again.
I love you, Spike. Good to see you again, Craig. Absolutely happy to come back and do it again. Have a good one, boys.
Awesome. Caleb, I'll let you let's let Caleb respond real quick, and then we'll have you right after Spike.
Okay,
Caleb,
well,
I also want you to respond too as well to the criticism, and this is something we have talked about too before. Eating breakfast together in Mexico, right? Like, too much centralized power in the digital age could be a problem. How do we solve that? How do we deal with that? But go ahead and finish us on out. Thank you, Caleb.
Sure. Well, I want to say that when it comes to protecting the civil liberties of Americans, communists have always been on the vanguard. It was communists who started the American Civil Liberties Union, and that they were kicked out of it during the McCarthy period. It was communists who fought for the right of women to vote. Women had the right to vote in the Soviet Union before they had it in the United States. It was communists that were marching against police brutality long before it was trendy and hip. You know, back in the early years of the 21st century, I was going to court with police brutality victims, and it was not trendy at all. Black Lives Matter had never been tweeted. And opposing the war on drugs. I mean, communists have been at the center of opposing the U.S. imperialist state and its crackdown and its attacks on the freedom of Americans. And that's important to point out. Meanwhile, the defense generally of violations of civil liberties in the United States has come in the name of anti-communism, in the name of private property. The Civil Rights Act, it was violating the right of small business owners to discriminate. Next, we're going to have communism. Race mixing is communism. That was the rallying cry. Martin Luther King Jr. was called a communist. And historically, communists have been on the vanguard of the struggle for freedom in the United States. And our history there needs to be acknowledged. The other thing that I want to say when it comes to centralized power is that this is the reality of all civilization and all human history, which is that the only thing that protects the weak from the strong is law and morality. If you get rid of law and you get rid of morality, there's nothing to stop the strong from just brutally terrorizing and ruling over the weak. And in our society, strength is determined by money. Those with the most money are the strongest. And if you get rid of law and you get rid of morality, if you say, well, we're not going to have any laws to regulate business, just let them do whatever they want. If you say, you know, might is right and compassion is a form of weakness, like Ayn Rand said. I'm not saying you guys are objectivists, but that's a big current among libertarians. If you push that in there, if you get rid of law and you get rid of morality, then what you get is the law of the jungle, where the strongest rule over the weak with unrestrained force. And the whole history of human civilization has been people coming together and saying, we're not going to have the law of the jungle. We're going to set up some kind of social order to protect the weak from the strong, to try and make things more fair, to try and act like you know, civilized people, not barbarians and not cave people in the woods. And that, yes, laws historically have been unfair. And yes, there's been cronyism. And yes, you know, as we went from slavery to feudalism and feudalism to capitalism, but the goal is to get to a higher plane. And the goal is to enhance our ability as human beings to be productive and create enough wealth that the need for some kind of social structure like law can be abolished. And there'll be enough that people won't feel a need to savagely terrorize each other in the struggle for life. And I think that's the point that needs to be raised. And look, at this point, the main danger to humanity is coming from wokeness. It's coming from the World Economic Forum. It's coming from the European Union. It's coming from NATO. It's coming from the forces that want to impose their fascist degrowth agenda to drive down living standards, to set up a low-wage police state here in America. And I will march arm in arm and stand in solidarity with anyone who will stand up to these folks. They do it in the name of anti-racism and social justice and blah, 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 but it's all a lie. They are setting the stage for World War III. They are setting the stage for an enforced low-wage police state and the unrestrained rule of the big monopolies, Jeff Bezos and ExxonMobil. And I want to be at the center of a coalition of people that will reject the woke fascism that is coming down on the world, that'll tell Greta Thunberg to go to hell. That's where I want to be. And if libertarians are part of that, I love libertarians.
I think that is somewhere we can get to. And before I let you jump in, Spike, I just want Caleb, if central planning or too much power at top is not your main criticism of communism, give us a criticism of communism that you can understand where a lot of people who are not communist are coming from.
You can't have equality in poverty. And that is something that was learned throughout the 20th century. In China during the Cultural Revolution, they tried to have equality in poverty. It was a poor country, and they said, well, we can make everyone equal, and that'll be okay. No, it wasn't. In Cuba in the 1960s, they had a similar thing. Well, we're going to try to make everyone equal, even though we're poor. The basis of eradicating inequality is abundance. As Deng Xiaoping, the leader of communism in China, he said that poverty is not socialism, and to be rich is glorious. And unfortunately, because the socialist countries were surrounded and isolated and barricaded, many of them fell into the trap of trying to create an egalitarian society in poverty. And that was a disaster. And I will admit that the Cultural Revolution, the Yezhovshchina, the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, these things were bad. And it's a good thing that the global communist movement has rejected that. Furthermore, religion and the right to pray in whatever church you want and to practice your faith, that's also very important. And there was horrendous persecution of religious people in China, in the Soviet Union. And the fact that the communists in those countries have apologized for that, I think, is a very good thing. And the fact that now, especially in Latin America, many of the voices advocating socialism and communism are Christians.
Yeah, very hardcore Christians.
Is a Roman Catholic. The Nicaraguans, their slogan of the government everywhere is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. So I think, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zhuganov, he's an Orthodox Christian. So I think that when it comes to religious freedom and when it comes to trying to build an egalitarian society, there have been mistakes that have certainly been made. And I'm glad that the global communist movement has advanced from that. The woke left hasn't.
So, Spike, your thoughts about what I was talking about earlier, as far as like the criticism of maybe not accepting, you don't have to accept socialism, but those who advocate for it are advocating for better labor, a better labor situation without corporations raping them blind and stuff. Do you think that, how do you address those people as a libertarian? Because you've done this so well. This is why I became Team Spike early. So go ahead and give your best shot at it. Since I got all mad and hussy and pussy that the Twitter at the Libertarian Party has one of the three I think there's three personalities there, but one of them, I'm like, what the hell are you doing? We're planning a big march over here. How do we address socialism without crushing it or crushing the needs and the wants of the people who stand behind it?
Yeah, so I can't comment specifically on whatever tweet you're talking about because I actually spend, believe it or not, very little time on social media. I go on, I post my stuff, and then I leave for my own mental health mostly. So I will say that, and the more I see people online, the more that vindicates my decision to do that. But I will say that anytime that we are not focusing, and when I say we, I mean libertarians, and the Libertarian Party as part of that liberty movement. Anytime that we're not focusing, laser focused on whatever authoritarian thing that we're trying to oppose and whatever anti-authoritarian libertarian solution we're trying to suggest as an alternative to that, then we're failing. So if there was any giving of as you put it, a tongue path and blowing smoke up the ass or whatever of the American system, not only did that not serve the Libertarian Party, because we are explicitly against the vast majority of what makes up the American system, and what parts of the system we like are the parts where the government is leaving people alone and not imposing this corporatism on them. But we're also not serving the needs of people who need us right now. This is something I say a lot. We can talk about theory all day long. There are people who are suffering right now. There are people in prison right now because they got caught with medicinal herbs too many times. And because they hit the 3 strikes law, they're never going to see the light of day until we remove the monsters who put them in there. There are people who right now are mourning the loss of loved ones because of the militarized police state. There are people right now who are suffering under the control of their communities by criminal gangs, because the war on drugs has so empowered the black market drug cartels that they've taken over entire communities, not just here, but in places like Latin America, where they're literally sending their children off with human smugglers to bring them here, knowing that it's almost certain that they will suffer as a result of it and end up in a cage, because it's better than the alternative of them being stuck in their home countries where they are almost certain to be slaughtered en masse because they didn't vote for the right narco drug party that's backed by the CIA. So there are people suffering right now. And we shouldn't see people as communist, socialist, capitalist, whatever. They're human beings who are suffering because there is way too much power in the hands of way too few people. And if we had more time, we could deconstruct all of the different ways that has manifested itself among both systems that have called themselves capitalist and systems that have called themselves communist. The one thing I do want to push back a little on is you're 100% correct, Caleb. Libertarians were a major part of civil rights movement and the anti-police brutality and anti-war, but very often the communists were leading the charge because they were presented as the only alternative. And I'm certain that if we dug into the archives of anti-authoritarian moves in the so-called communist countries, that many of them probably fashioned themselves capitalists, even if they had looked at what you're considering capitalism and would say, no, we don't want that either, because it was seen as the only alternative. In a way, the authoritarian corporatist, or as you would call it, capitalist systems, and the authoritarian socialist systems are kind of similar to the duopoly that we have in the United States between the Republicans and Democrats, where you are presented with a false binary choice between one flavor of bad and another flavor of bad. And both of those happen to be authoritarian as well. So what I think that the Libertarian Party should do, not just as a party, but in the coalitions we build with others, is focus on where we agree. This system is not working. It is not working because there are powerful people who are imposing a system on you to enrich themselves at your expense and at the expense of people that haven't even been born yet. And if you die in the process, oh well. We need to oppose that on all fronts, work with anyone that we can work with to oppose that. And if we have disagreements over, us disagreeing over what our preferred utopian society would look like is the equivalent of me and Caleb being in the back of a van that's speeding off of a cliff and we're handcuffed and we're arguing over what kind of restaurant we'd open if we weren't about to die. I think it's sure we can have that conversation, but how about we get the handcuffs off and start walking our way back to where we want to set up the restaurant, and then we can figure it out from there. I love, as a internet libertarian, I love a good argument over which utopian system would be better than the other as much as any other libertarian on the internet. But I think that our focus when we're building coalitions and when we're trying to spread the party message needs to be laser focused on this system is bad. It's the one that we're being forced to live under, and we propose something far better. And to whatever extent we can work with people like Caleb, people on the anti-authoritarian left, people in the anti-authoritarian center, people who are just suffering and have absolutely no clue what they believe, that's what we should be focusing on. And I'm glad that we had a chance to do that, even as we disagreed over what we would prefer to have as an alternative.
I think that's great. And I think that's a great way to end the show and stuff. Y'all want to know why I was Team Spike? There it is right there. Ladies and gentlemen,
build a mass movement to stop the low-wage police state, stop World War III.
100%.
Do all we can.
100%. Absolutely.
Doomsday clock
100%.
is 90 seconds, right? 90 seconds away, the closest it's ever been. We got German tanks about to hit the grounds in Ukraine. This is like, remember,
always ends well.
Yeah, the war to end all wars.
German tanks moving east always ends well, guys.
So let's end the show today, guys. Thank you so much. Great conversation over here. Remember, February 19th, Rage Against the War Machine down in D.C. Come check us out. For Pasta Jardula, my partner Fiorella, who couldn't make it today. Thank you to Spike Cohen, Caleb Maupin, and David Smith. We'll see you soon, guys. Convo out. We'll be back on Friday.
Thanks.